Kethral Vaughan stood in the briefing chamber of the warship Eternal Dominion and tried not to yawn. Around him, 300 soldiers of the 4th Talon Regiment sat in perfect rows, their gray scales catching the blue light from the holographic display. The High Commander was speaking, but Kethral had already stopped listening. He had seen this before. 12 campaigns across the galaxy had taught him what these briefings really meant. Another primitive world. Another easy conquest. Another waste of his talents. The hologram showed a blue and green planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. It was beautiful, Kethral admitted. Oceans covered most of its surface, and white clouds swirled across its face like paint strokes. The inhabitants called it Earth, according to the intelligence reports. The native species calls themselves humans, the High Commander said. His voice was flat and bored, as if he was reading a shopping list. They are carbon-based bipeds with a civilization approximately 300 years behind our own. They possess no energy weapons, no personal shielding technology, and no faster-than-light capability. They have not yet unified their planet under a single government. A soft ripple of amusement passed through the assembled soldiers. Kethral allowed himself a small smile. A species that had not even unified their own world? This would not be a war. This would be a collection exercise. Their weapons are primitive kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives, the commander continued. Our shields will render these ineffective. Intelligence estimates suggest that organized resistance will collapse within 2 planetary rotations. Your task is simple. Secure designated territories and await further orders for resource extraction. Kethral looked at the planet again. The humans had divided their world into sections they called countries. His regiment had been assigned to an area called Eastern Europe. The intelligence files showed images of the terrain. Forests, rivers, cities made of stone and metal. The humans in these regions were described as agricultural workers and factory laborers, farmers, workers, not warriors. After the briefing ended, Kethral walked with his old friend Morith through the corridors of the ship. Morith was a large Volanthe, even by their species standards, with scars crossing his face from the war against the Sketh hive mind. This feels like an insult, Morith grumbled. We fought the Sketh. We broke the Calculon consensus. And now they send us to collect farmers? Kethral nodded. The High Council wants to blood the new recruits. Give them an easy victory before sending them against real enemies. The new ones need it, Morith admitted. He gestured toward a group of young soldiers walking ahead of them. Their scales were still bright green, unmarked by battle. They laughed and joked with each other, excited about their first deployment. Look at them. They think war is a game. They will learn, Kethral said. Every soldier does, eventually. They reached the armory and began checking their equipment. Kethral ran his claws over his plasma rifle, feeling its familiar weight. The weapon had killed hundreds of enemies across a dozen worlds. It seemed almost shameful to use it against primitives who still fought with chemical propellants and metal projectiles. His personal shield generator hummed softly as he activated it. The device created an invisible barrier around his body that could stop any fast-moving object. Plasma bolts, laser beams, railgun rounds, nothing could penetrate it. The humans' weapons would be even less of a threat. Their bullets were slow, almost laughably so. The shield would catch them easily. The night before deployment, Kethral sat in his quarters and reviewed the intelligence files one more time. He studied images of human soldiers, soft-looking creatures wrapped in fabric and metal. They carried their primitive rifles and posed for pictures with expressions that his translator identified as pride or confidence. He felt something close to pity. These creatures had no idea what was coming. They had spent their entire existence fighting each other with their crude weapons, thinking themselves warriors. They had never faced a real enemy. They had never seen plasma fire turn a body to ash in half a second. They had never felt the ground shake under orbital bombardment. Tomorrow they would learn. And the lesson would be short. The morning of deployment arrived with mechanical efficiency. Catherall led his squad of 15 soldiers to the drop pod bay. The young ones were nervous now, their earlier excitement replaced by the tight silence that came before battle. The veterans were calm, checking their weapons one final time, saying nothing. Catherall climbed into his drop pod and felt it seal around him. Through the small viewport, he could see Earth growing larger as the Eternal Dominion moved into position. The planet's sun was rising over the curved horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink dot. It really was beautiful, he thought again. A shame that its inhabitants had to be conquered. But the hegemony needed resources, and this world had plenty. The humans would be given a choice: submit and serve, or resist and die. Catherall had seen it happen many times before. Most species chose submission after the first few battles. The smart ones surrendered immediately. He wondered which type the humans would be. Deployment in 30 seconds, the ship's voice announced. Catherall closed his eyes and steadied his breathing. Around him, 15 drop pods hummed with energy, ready to carry his squad down to the surface. Below them, the humans were waking up to their last normal day, going to work, eating breakfast, living their small lives without knowing that everything was about to change. 10 seconds. He felt the familiar tension in his muscles, the focus that came before combat. It was unnecessary for this mission, he knew, but old habits died hard. 5 seconds. The clamps released. The pod shook as it fell from the warship, and Earth's gravity took hold. Through the viewport, Catherall watched the atmosphere begin to glow orange around him. The heat shields activated, and the pod trembled as it cut through the air dot below him. A world of 7 billion humans waited, unaware that their conquerors had arrived. Catherall felt nothing but boredom. This would be over quickly. He was wrong. 3 weeks had passed since the landing, and Catherall no longer recognized the war he was fighting. He crouched in the ruins of what had once been a human city, surrounded by the shattered remains of buildings and the smell of smoke and death. His squad had been reduced to 4 soldiers, including himself. Reinforcements arrived regularly, but they died almost as fast as they landed. The humans were not what the intelligence reports had described. They were something else entirely. Something worse. Catherall had begun keeping a personal record of everything he learned about them. He wrote it at night when he could not sleep, as a way of processing the horrors he witnessed. He hoped that if he died, someone would find it and learn from his mistakes. The first thing he learned was that humans did not sleep like normal creatures. A Volanti soldier needed 8 hours of rest to function properly. Humans needed less, and some of them could fight for days without any rest at all. They used chemical substances, injecting them directly into their blood, which allowed them to ignore their body's need for sleep. It was insane. It was destroying their health. They did not care. The second thing he learned was that humans felt pain but could choose to ignore it. He had witnessed this himself during a firefight in the city's central district. A human soldier had taken a plasma bolt to his left arm, burning through flesh and bone. Any Volanti would have collapsed from shock. The human had looked at his ruined arm, wrapped a strip of cloth around the wound to stop the bleeding, picked up his weapon with his remaining hand, and kept fighting for another hour until he finally passed out from blood loss. The third thing he learned was that humans did not fight fair. They did not believe in concepts like honor or proper warfare. They attacked from hiding, struck without warning, and retreated before you could respond. They planted explosive devices in roads, in buildings, in the bodies of their own dead. They poisoned water supplies, set fires that spread for kilometers, and used their own civilians as shields and weapons. But the worst thing, the thing that haunted Cathral's dreams, was their psychological warfare. It started with sounds. At night, the humans would broadcast noises through speakers, hidden throughout the ruins. Screaming, crying, laughter that went on for hours without stopping. Sometimes they played their music harsh, aggressive sounds that the translator could not properly render. They would play it at maximum volume for entire nights, making sleep impossible. Then came the messages. Dead Volanti soldiers would be found arranged in patterns, their bodies posed in positions of fear or surrender. Warning symbols were painted on walls using Volanti blood. Notes were left in the hegemony's own language, containing threats and insults and predictions of death. The soldiers began to break, not from the fighting itself, but from the constant, grinding terror. They jumped at shadows. They fired at sounds that were not there. Some refused to leave the camp. Others simply walked into the ruins alone and never came back. Cathral tried to maintain discipline, but he could feel his own mind starting to crack. He had not slept properly in weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Yelthi's head exploding. He heard the human voice on the communicator, welcoming him to Earth. The moment he truly understood what they were facing came on the 22nd. His squad had cornered a human soldier in a destroyed building. She was badly wounded, with damage to her internal organs that would kill her within minutes. There was no possibility of survival. She knew it. They knew it. Cathral approached her carefully, weapon raised. He wanted to take a prisoner. He wanted to ask questions, to understand how these primitive creatures were destroying his people so effectively. The human looked up at him. She was young, with short dark hair and pale skin covered in dust and blood. Her breathing was labored, each breath a struggle. But she was smiling. "Why do you smile?" Cathral asked through his translator. "You are dying." The human's smile grew wider. She said something in her language, and the translator rendered it in its flat mechanical voice. "See you in hell." Then she pulled something from her chest, a small metal device with a ring attached. Cathral had seen these before. He knew what they did. He threw himself backward, but he was too slow. The explosion killed 3 of his remaining soldiers instantly. Cathral survived only because the body of another Volanti absorbed most of the blast. He lay in the rubble for a long time, bleeding from dozens of small wounds, staring at the sky through the broken ceiling. The human woman was gone, not just dead, but destroyed, scattered across the room in pieces too small to identify. She had known she was dying. She could have surrendered, received medical attention, perhaps even survived. Instead, she had chosen to take as many enemies with her as possible. That was when Cathral finally understood. Humans did not fight to win. They fought to make victory cost so much that winning became meaningless. They would burn their own world before letting someone else take it. They would die in agony if it meant killing one more enemy. They were not soldiers. They were something far more dangerous. They were believers. That night, Cathral updated his personal record with a single sentence. "We came to conquer a primitive species. We have awakened something that will never stop fighting until one of us is completely destroyed." He was beginning to fear it would not be them. The drop pod hit the ground with a heavy thud, and Cathral was moving before the doors finished opening. Morning mist hung between the trees, thick and white, reducing visibility to 20 meters. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth and pine. It was strangely pleasant. Around him, 14 other pods had landed in a rough circle. His soldiers emerged quickly, forming a defensive perimeter while their scanners swept the area. The readings showed nothing threatening. A few animals fled through the undergrowth. Birds screamed warnings from the treetops. But no humans. Area secure, Morris reported, his massive frame casting a shadow in the gray light. No enemy contacts. Nearest human settlement is 3 kilometers north. Catherall nodded and consulted his tactical display. Their objective was a small town. Population 8,000 according to orbital scans. They were to secure it, establish a command post, and wait for reinforcements. Simple work. Move out, he ordered. Standard formation. Stay alert. They advanced through the forest in a loose column, weapons ready but spirits high. The young soldiers whispered to each other, pointing at strange plants and unusual insects. One of them, a female named Yelthi, was collecting samples and storing them in her pack. Focus, Catherall told her. You can study the local life forms after the area is secured. Yelthi nodded quickly, embarrassed. Yes, Sergeant. Sorry, Sergeant. They walked for 20 minutes without incident. The forest began to thin, and Catherall could see open fields ahead. Agricultural land, just as the intelligence reports had described. Crops grew in neat rows, and primitive machines sat idle near a wooden structure. Beautiful country, Morith observed. The humans chose a good world to evolve on. Catherall was about to respond when something strange happened. Yelthi's head exploded. There was no warning. No sound. One moment she was walking beside him, and the next moment her skull simply came apart in a spray of violet blood and gray matter. Her body stood upright for a full second before collapsing to the ground. Everyone froze. Contact! Catherall screamed, but even as the word left his mouth, he realized he had no idea where the contact was. His scanner showed nothing. No heat signatures. No movement. No energy readings. Another shot. Private Vestral spun and fell, a hole the size of a fist in his chest. His personal shield had not activated. The projectile had passed through as if the shield was not there. Chaos erupted. Soldiers dove for cover, but there was no cover in the open field. They fired their plasma rifles in random directions, the bright blue bolts cutting through the mist and striking nothing but trees and dirt. Where are they? Someone shouted. I don't see anything. Another soldier fell. Then another. The shots came from everywhere and nowhere, each one finding its target with terrible precision. Catherall pressed himself against the ground and tried to think. The humans were using kinetic weapons, primitive bullets. But the shields should have stopped them. Why hadn't the shields stopped them? Then he understood. The shields were designed to stop fast-moving projectiles, plasma bolts traveling at thousands of meters per second. The human bullets were slow by comparison. Too slow to trigger the shield's activation threshold. They passed through because the shields did not recognize them as threats. Fall back. Catherall roared. Fall back to the tree line. They ran. Disciplined soldiers of the Volanthi hegemony, veterans of a dozen wars, ran like frightened animals through the mist while invisible death hunted them. Catherall saw Morith take a round in the shoulder, but his friend kept running, purple blood streaming down his arm. They reached the trees and threw themselves behind thick trunks. The shooting stopped. Silence returned to the forest, broken only by the harsh breathing of the survivors and the distant calls of birds. Catherall counted his squad. 7 bodies lay in the field behind them. 7 soldiers dead in less than 2 minutes. He had not seen a single enemy. What happened? One of the young soldiers whispered. His voice was shaking. What just happened? No one answered. They waited for an hour, but no attack came. Eventually, Catherall sent scouts to search the area where the shots had originated. They found nothing. No footprints. No shell casings. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The humans had appeared, killed 7 trained soldiers, and vanished like ghosts. That night, they made camp in a defensive position and tried to treat their wounded. Morith would survive. but his arm would never be the same. 2 others had minor injuries. Everyone else was simply terrified. Kethril sat apart from the group and composed his first report to High Command. His claws trembled slightly as he typed the words. He had fought the Sketh hive mind, whose warriors felt no pain and no fear. He had faced the Calculon consensus, whose robot soldiers calculated optimal killing trajectories in milliseconds. None of them had scared him like this. He included a phrase he never thought he would. WRITE. Request immediate tactical reassessment. Enemy capabilities severely underestimated. The response came within an hour. High Command acknowledged his report, but offered no guidance. Other units had experienced similar ambushes across the planet. Casualties were higher than expected. Much higher down as Kethril tried to sleep. His communicator crackled with static. Then a voice spoke, a human voice, transmitted on Volanthi frequencies. "Welcome to Earth," the voice said. The translator rendered the words in flat, mechanical tones, but Kethril could hear something underneath. Amusement, perhaps. Or anticipation. "We've been waiting for you." The transmission ended. Kethril lay awake until dawn, staring at the dark trees and wondering what he had gotten himself into. 2 months into the war, and Kethril had been promoted twice. Not because of excellence or skill, but because everyone above him was dead. He now commanded what remained of an entire battalion. On paper, a battalion was 800 soldiers. In reality, Kethril had 43 soldiers under his command, huddled inside a forward operating base that was under constant attack. The base had been a human school once. Kethril had found books in the rubble, filled with pictures of smiling children and simple lessons. Now it was a fortress surrounded by walls of burned vehicles and broken concrete. Every night, the humans probed their defenses. Every day, they counted their dead. The hegemony had sent reinforcements. Thousands of fresh troops had landed across the planet, equipped with new weapons and updated shield technology that could detect slow-moving projectiles. It should have turned the tide of the war, but it had not. The humans adapted faster than anyone could have predicted. Within days of the new shields being deployed, they had found ways around them. They used weapons that fired projectiles at varying speeds, confusing the shield's detection systems. They used explosives that released clouds of metal fragments too numerous to stop. They used fire and acid and poison gas primitive, chemical weapons that the shields were never designed to counter. But the weapons were not the real problem. The real problem was that the humans simply refused to stop fighting. Kethril had learned new words in the past 2 months. Terrible words that described terrible things. Guerrilla warfare, which meant fighting without rules or boundaries. Scorched earth, which meant destroying everything, including your own resources, to deny them to the enemy. Total war, which meant there were no civilians, no non-combatants, no safe zones. The humans had burned their own cities. They had poisoned their own rivers. Farmers had picked up weapons and become soldiers. Children carried messages and planted bombs. Elderly humans served as scouts and spies. The entire population had transformed into an army. There was no pacified territory. Every area the hegemony claimed secure would erupt in violence within days. Every building hid potential enemies. Every road concealed possible traps. The Volanthi soldiers had stopped walking anywhere. They had lost too many to buried explosives. Morth was dead. Kethril had found his friend's body 3 weeks ago, lying in an alley with his throat cut. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. Morth, who had survived the Sketh and the Calculon, who had fought in 12 campaigns across the galaxy, had died in silence at the hands of a species that had not even achieved spaceflight. The remaining soldiers were falling apart. Not physically, mentally. The Volanthi warriors were trained to face death, but they were not trained for this. They were not trained for an enemy that felt joy in dying, that sang songs while being executed, that smiled while bleeding to death. Kethral had captured a human officer 2 weeks ago. He had hoped to gain intelligence, to find some weakness they could exploit. The interrogation had not gone as planned. The human was a middle-aged male with gray in his hair and cold blue eyes. He had been beaten and bound, but he showed no fear. When Kethral asked him questions, he laughed. "You think this is bad?" The human said through the translator. "We did worse to each other for centuries. We burned each other alive over which imaginary friend was correct. We killed millions because of the color of their skin. We dropped weapons on our own cities that made the ground glow for generations." Kethral stared at him, not understanding. The human leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle. "You are not special. You are not the worst thing that has ever happened to us. You are just next." 2 days later, the human had escaped. He killed 4 guards on his way out, using nothing but a piece of broken metal he had hidden somewhere on his body. They never found out where. Now Kethral stood on the roof of the school, watching the distant fires that marked human positions, and waited for the communication from high command that he knew was coming. It arrived at midnight. The message was brief and direct. The hegemony was considering orbital bombardment. Extinction level force. They would burn the planet's surface clean, killing every human being, and harvest the resources from the ashes. Kethral read the message twice. Then he turned off his communicator and sat down heavily on the cold concrete. He had won 12 campaigns. He had brought glory to the hegemony and honor to his family name. He had believed in the righteousness of their cause-spreading order across the galaxy, civilizing primitive species, harvesting resources for the greater good. Now he sat in the ruins of a school, commanding the survivors of a shattered battalion, waiting for his leaders to commit genocide, because they could not defeat farmers and factory workers in a fair fight. He felt no triumph. He felt only shame. Below him, in the darkness, something moved. Kethral raised his weapon and aimed at the shadows. Nothing happened. Nothing attacked. But he knew they were out there, watching, waiting. They were always waiting. He wondered if the orbital bombardment would actually work. He wondered if the humans had already planned for that possibility. He wondered what kind of species could make an empire of 1,000 worlds consider burning an entire planet just to be rid of them. He was beginning to think he would never find out. He was beginning to think none of them would survive long enough. 15 years had passed since the war ended. Kethral walked slowly through the corridors of the Galactic Council building, his claws clicking against the polished stone floor. He was old now, his scales faded from gray to pale white, his body marked by scars that would never fully heal. He walked with a permanent limp, a gift from a human explosive that had destroyed his left leg and forced the medics to rebuild it with synthetic parts, but he had survived. That was more than most could say. The war had not ended with a Velanti victory. It had not ended with a human defeat. It had ended with something unprecedented in the long history of the hegemony, a negotiated ceasefire. The orbital bombardment had never happened. The High Council had voted against it, not out of mercy, but out of fear. Intelligence reports had revealed that the humans had prepared for the possibility. They had hidden millions of their people in underground shelters, stockpiled resources for decades of survival, and armed themselves with weapons capable of reaching orbit. If the hegemony burned their surface, the survivors would eventually emerge angrier than ever, with nothing left to lose. So instead, they talked. For the first time in 500 years, the hegemony sat across a table from an enemy and negotiated peace. The cost had been terrible on both sides. Billions of humans had died. Entire cities had been reduced to ash. Continents had been rendered uninhabitable by chemical weapons and nuclear fire. Yes, The humans had used nuclear fire on their own world, rather than let the hegemony hold it. The Lanthi casualties had exceeded all previous wars combined, but humanity had survived. And in surviving, they had earned something that no other species had ever achieved: a seat at the galactic table. Not as a conquered people, not as a subjugated species, but as equals. As partners. As a warning. Today, Kethral had been called to testify before the full council. Representatives from 100 different species filled the circular chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of colors and shapes. Some were old enemies of the hegemony. Some were new arrivals, just beginning to explore the stars. All of them wanted to know about humanity. Some were considering trade agreements. Some were considering military alliances. A few were considering war, though they were wise enough not to say so openly. They had all heard stories about Earth's defenders, but stories were not enough. They wanted the truth from someone who had experienced it firsthand. They wanted Kethral's testimony. He stood at the center of the chamber, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him, and began to speak. He told them everything. He told them about the first ambush in the forest, when invisible enemies had killed 7 of his soldiers without showing themselves. He told them about the siege of the cities, where humans had fought building by building, room by room, dying by the thousands, but never surrendering. He told them about the psychological warfare, the sounds in the night, the bodies arranged as warnings, the constant grinding terror. He told them about human cruelty, their capacity for violence that exceeded anything he had witnessed in all his years of war. But he also told them about human compassion. He described the medic who had treated his wounds after his capture during the final days of the war. A young male with gentle hands and tired eyes, who had called Kethral brother and meant it, who had risked his own safety to save an enemy soldier, simply because it was the right thing to do. He told them about human art and music, which the Volanthi soldiers had grown to love despite everything. Songs of loss and hope and defiance that transcended language, that spoke to something universal in all sentient beings. Paintings and sculptures that captured beauty and horror with equal skill. He told them about human societies, fractured, chaotic, constantly arguing among themselves about everything. Societies that somehow became stronger under external threat, that unified with terrifying speed when faced with a common enemy. Most importantly, he told them what he had learned, what the war had taught him, what he needed them to understand. Humans are not the strongest species, Kethral said. His voice was old and rough, but it carried clearly through the chamber. They are not the smartest. They are not the fastest or the most advanced. In almost every measurable way, they are average at best. He paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from worlds he had never visited, species he had never encountered. But they possess something far more dangerous than strength or intelligence. They possess something that I do not have a word for in my language. The closest translation would be refusal. The chamber was silent. Every being leaned forward, listening. They do not know how to give up, Kethral continued. The concept does not exist in their minds. You can beat them. You can burn their cities and kill their families and take everything they have. And they will keep fighting. They will fight with weapons. They will fight with rocks. They will fight with their bare hands and their teeth. They will fight until they are dead, and then their children will fight, and their children's children will fight until the end of time. He took a deep breath. If you go to war with humanity, you may win. You may burn their world to ash and salt the earth. You may kill every last one of them, but you will never be the same. They will crawl inside your mind and make a nest there. They will live in your dreams. You will see their faces when you close your eyes. You will hear their voices in the silence. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Every night. Every night for the rest of your lives. As I do. The chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then the council speaker thanked him for his testimony, and Kethro was dismissed. He walked slowly toward the exit, his synthetic leg clicking against the floor. The corridors were empty, except for a single figure standing near the door. It was a human. She was young, dressed in the formal attire of a diplomatic attaché, with dark hair and confident posture. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. As he passed her, she nodded respectfully. Kethro stopped and nodded back. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Former enemies. Reluctant equals. Two survivors of a war that had changed everything. The human smiled. A small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Kethro understood that smile. He had seen it before on the face of a dying soldier in a ruined building. Moments before she pulled the pin on her explosive dot, it was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, and was not afraid to prove it again if necessary. He nodded once more and walked away, leaving her standing in the corridor. Behind him, he heard her footsteps heading in the opposite direction, toward the council chamber. Humanity had earned its place among the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same. Neither would he.